Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Acacia Hills Kent wash process Tanzania from Nomad Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Nomad, based out of Barcelona, Spain, and they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including a recent review of the Cabingo, a honey processed Burundi coffee. And one of the main reasons I was happy that coffee won our Coffee of the Month poll was because it did give me an opportunity to purchase this coffee as well, as it caught my interest for a couple of reasons. The first of which being that it is a Tanzanian coffee, and I've had some pretty positive experiences with Tanzanian coffees over the last couple of years. And the second reason being the varietal, as this one is a Kent AA, and that's a varietal I'd actually never heard of before seeing this coffee, so that certainly caught my interest, and we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, and a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, this one is another one of Nomad's filter roasted options, which is to say that it's a very light coffee relative to the majority of coffee roasters out there. There are definitely some lighter roasting European coffee roasters currently, but this one once again does still skew on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we opted for the V60 with the cup offering an interesting candied fruit attribute in a slightly dried yellow fruit sense, with a little bit of that Probat-like caramelized aspect to it as well. In addition to that, there's a bit of palm fruit brightness in a higher than anticipated sense, lending itself towards a pretty nice start. And once again, as I mentioned, I'd never heard of this varietal before this review, so typically when it comes to most varietals, you have a somewhat decent idea of what to expect from the coffee itself. But with this one, given I'd never even heard of it, I really had no idea what to expect from it in general. And that's why this first impression was kind of interesting. And from this point going forward, it would actually remind me of a couple of different things. As on day 18, we opted for the Chemex, and it wasn't quite as good, with a little bit more of a Kenyan-like feel to the cup, at least in regards to the tart brightness in a lingering sense. It wasn't quite as sweet either on this day, lending itself towards a different experience this time around. Day 21 through the April brewer, and there's still a slight bit more tameness to it than some of the earlier impressions, as it's offering a mostly yellow fruit aspect with some more of that palm fruit brightness yet again. Relatively tame in general, with more of that subtle Kenyan-like feel yet again. And as mentioned, really had no idea what to expect with this varietal, but as of this moment, it's skewed a little bit more reminiscent of some Kenyan coffees in general. Day 24 through the V60 with Nomad's recipe, and this is the best the coffee had been to this point, as it did have a slight bit more of a sugary sweetness and caramelized aspect to it. So I was wondering if maybe this coffee was just opening up in general, and if you watched our Cabingo honey review, then I said that coffee never really seemed to fully open up, and given that I was drinking these two coffees side by side, I was beginning to wonder whether or not this one was going to as well. Cup was slightly reminiscent of what I would describe as being simple syrup, and I think they have something along the lines of a syrup note listed on here, which makes a lot of sense. A tangy brightness in a near Kenyan-like level, though it was a little bit different. Also a slightly bittered sense to it as well, lending itself towards a relatively unique experience, as once again, I don't necessarily think I've had a lot of coffees that have been like this. If anything, it just gave me shades and characteristics of some other origins and varietals in general. Day 27 through the Chemex with Nomad's recipe, and it was a bit reminiscent of some of the earlier experiences, as it's offering a slight bit more on the softer side of things for the sugar aspects. In addition to that, the tangy brightness is present yet again, with this cup opening up a fair bit more as it did cool down. It's still slightly subtle overall, as the Chemex didn't necessarily do a lot of justice in terms of increasing the overall intensity. Day 30 through the V60 with Nomad's recipe, and this is the best the cup had been to this point. While it still remains on the mostly subtle side of things, it has increased slightly with the overall intensity and sweetness in that sugary syrup-like aspect, with more of that brown candy Probat-like sweetness as well. So it's reminiscent as well of the experiences we had with the Cabingo honey, as the cup just seemed to improve every single time we had adjusted it. That coffee was perhaps a little bit more consistent, and granted, we're not really tinkering with these coffees too much, as once again, Nomad's recipe isn't too too dissimilar from our own at a 16:1 versus a 17:1 water to coffee ratio. They even brew at the same temperature, so I was fully expecting these coffees to be pretty consistent with a lot of the adjustments we had made, which goes to show that this one was perhaps a little less consistent than that Kabingo honey. It's still relatively consistent, but for the most part, just these slight tweaks do seem to adjust and result in different cups in general. In addition to that, it was accompanied by that Kenyan-like berry aspect yet again, so that continues to remain an ever-present quality within this one. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it continues to feel like it's on the verge of potential throughout, as it still hasn't quite opened up as much as I might have expected. In addition to that, there's a continued focus on the softer light sugar scents, with the brightness coming through a bit more in the finish, so once again, still pretty consistent in general. Day 36 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it continues to remain a little unique and different with a similar experience to the day 30 mark. A slight bit more of those tart berry aspects and a predominantly sugary syrup sweetness. In addition to that, the intensity does seem to linger on the palate with a slight caramelized sweetness in the finish. So I think the best way to describe this coffee is that a lot of these aspects remain a little bit more subtle in their overall pronunciation of them. So it's one of those things where the entire cup is just a little bit more soft in general. So these aspects you're feeling, they're just maybe a little bit more pronounced the more you let it kind of linger on your palate. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and it is the finish level 5. And I looked at this tasting wheel immediately after sipping that coffee and said to myself, oh yeah, this one does have that level 5 in terms of the overall finish to it. And yeah, it really does. And it's kind of strange because once again, it's just a little unique relative to what I was expecting, but that just kind of interesting lingering palate quality that I continue to harp on is something that this coffee offers. A little bit of that slightly bitter but mostly tart berry aspect to this one, and that slight syrupy sugary quality to it. Given that this coffee is so soft, you just kind of feel the same experience you had right from the onset towards the end, but you're maybe able to just pick the experience out a little bit more as the cup continues to linger on the palate, but it lingers for a fair bit, and that's why it's just very interesting that it did score at that level 5 mark. A couple of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Given that this coffee is so soft and tame for the majority of it, it's no surprise whatsoever that it did finish at that level 4 mark, and it's not really hindered by anything that could really take away from that, and it doesn't have enough quality in terms of the definition to the cup to really justify anything higher than that. So this is, of course, what you'd expect for a true level 4 with a coffee that is as soft as it is. Acidity level 4, and that one is just kind of interesting to me. I think that they have some sort of note that would indicate some sort of palm fruit brightness, but you had a little bit of a mix of that as well as a tart Kenyan berry aspect to it, which was also pretty interesting. But the brightness scored pretty high for this coffee, and I referenced that in the Kabingo honey that there was another coffee that really seemed to demonstrate how low the overall brightness and acidity was for that coffee. And then is this one right here, as I think this is the one that they had listed as maybe being a little bit more medium in terms of the brightness to it. But for me, I continue to get a lot of it throughout the entirety of the time consuming this one. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness level 3, and obviously that's going to be a big sticking point for me because I think that this is a coffee they listed as being on the sweeter side of things, and I think maybe sweetness is in the eye of the beholder on this one, because if you're really focusing on just how soft this cup of coffee is throughout the entirety, then I can see the sweetness being higher because it is that lingering sweetness. But even then, I kept thinking to myself, this coffee isn't necessarily that sweet, especially relative to the other coffees we're reviewing from Nomad. So 3 was the best place for me to put it on this one. Berry fruit level 3, mentioned it has a slight bit of those tart berry aspects, and it's a little bit more reminiscent of currants, if anything, for me. So that part was also pretty interesting. Stone fruit, I can't quite recall whether or not they had any sort of stone fruits listed on here, but yeah, even then there's a very subtle stone fruit quality to it and a slightly lighter stone fruit sense as well. Caramel level 3, that's been a little consistent with the experience we've had from these Nomad coffees. Once again, that Probat like caramelized aspect to it, which is my favorite part of Probat roasted coffees. Though this one, once again, given that the cup is just so subtle, it's scoring that high mostly because of how subtle this coffee is. I think a lot of the notes that you're looking at on this tasting wheel should be kept in the context that this coffee is so subtle to begin with, that anything scoring at the level 3 is just that soft, given that the entirety of the coffee is that soft to begin with. Savoriness level 3, and it did have an interesting sort of tea-like savory aspect to it, but once again, it also is in line with those berries aspects, so a little bit more of that savory berry component to it. And then the final thing worth discussing is two things actually. I want to discuss the bitterness real quick because I continued to mention that the slightly, we'll say, tart berry brightness of it does have a little bit of a bitter quality to it, and I wanted to just focus on that real quick. But then the last thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2, as maybe I have it backwards, and this is the Nomad coffee that they said is a little bit more medium bodied, but it turned out a little bit lighter bodied than I might have expected. But once again, I'm brewing these coffees side by side, this one as well as that Kabingo honey, to kind of make these tasting wheels. So that's why it was interesting that this one had a little bit of lighter body, that one had a little bit of a heavier body, but as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I promise I'm not just trying to spin these Nomad coffees in a positive light. I do think that they have been an interesting learning experience to both of them. This one is no exception to that as well, because it is fun and unique to try a different varietal, and I'm very happy that I got an opportunity to try this one, because if I ever have more Kent AA varietals in the future, I'll at least have an idea of a starting point with the way that these coffees should turn out. But given that this was my introduction of it, it offered something unique, and that's honestly what I really hope for, is since there's so many varietals out there in this world, each of them should offer some unique and different qualities or characteristics. So that's why I was very happy that this one did. I don't think I've had a coffee that has been reminiscent of this one in the past. I can't really think of anything that's had a similar profile to this one. How would I even describe this? It had a little bit of a kind of soft yellow fruit component. It had a little bit of a tart berry aspect, and it had a little bit of this kind of nondescript sugary quality to it, and those qualities all put together isn't something that you experience too often. So in that regard, I appreciate the coffee for what it was, just something a little different, at least in terms of the overall cleanliness to it, that I've experienced relative to the past. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like the best and first place to start with this is if you enjoy your Kenyan-like brightness, because that at least is a starting point for somebody that might have a little bit of familiarity with this sort of coffee. Outside of that, somebody that might be a little bit more focused on the subtle side of these coffees, because that syrupy, sugary quality is much more subtle, and given that this coffee is just a little bit more subtle in general, then picking out that experience in a lingering sense is a little interesting in that aspect. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for a coffee like this, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Acacia Hills Kent wash process Tanzania from Nomad Coffee. Thank you for watching.